Good morning, everyone. You join me today on this Yamaha TDM 850. I believe this is a 99 or a 2000. I'm not entirely sure which year it is. But I borrowed this today from my mechanic. My Tracer 900 isn't getting its brake service right now, and he really kindly let me borrow his personal TDM. So we're riding this today, just kind of giving a bit of a first impression video about what I think is a really unique bike from the kind of mid to late 90s, and also a bike that's actually really relevant today as far as I guess just what kind of biking has become. I think this is kind of a precursor to a lot of the motorcycles we see today. So I kind of want to let you know a little bit about my thoughts on this bike and a little bit about the history, and yeah, we'll have some fun. So the TDM 850, this is a super unique bike, and I think it was probably pretty unique when it came out in the early 90s too. So this is the second generation of the TDM. The first one came out in, I think, 90 or 91. It's kind of a unique bike in that it's the start of this kind of road-oriented trail bike, or tall rounder, as I've heard some people call them more recently. But essentially what this is it's, you know, by looking at it, it looks kind of like the Africa Twin or the old Tenerays, but it's got, you know, a lot more road-biased tires on it. It's not really meant for off-roading at all, despite the look, and that was quite unique at the time. So speaking of the Teneray, the engine in this bike is actually taken from the old Teneray 750. Obviously, it's had its capacity increased to 850, but it's still a parallel twin, which, again, might sound a little familiar to some of you today. And it's only making about 70 horsepower, 50 foot-pounds of torque, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, and I suppose it really isn't, but the way it delivers it is super smooth. It feels quite torquey for the size, and it's just a really fun engine all around. I mentioned before this is the second generation. So the original generation had a 360-degree firing order. This one, the second generation, they moved it to a 270-degree. So again, very similar to what you see in parallel twins today, where they kind of changed that firing order to give the engine a little bit more character, make it feel a little bit more fun. So yeah, the 850cc parallel twin, Yamaha did use it in a couple other bikes. I think they also used the same engine in the TRX 850 from the late 90s. Although it doesn't really share that many similarities with the TRX. The frame is a more standard kind of box section frame. It's not the trellis frame that you see on the TRX. But yeah, at the time, there wasn't really anything else like this. You had the kind of big trailies like the Transalp and the Africa Twin. But those kind of did have pretensions of being off-road bikes, whereas the TDM certainly did not. So, you know, nowadays we might call this a sport tourer, but at the time, sport tourers were still things like the VFR 750, right? They were more derived from sport bikes, closer to sport bikes than to tourers, if that makes sense. So I think this is interesting in that, you know, it kind of precludes a lot of what we see in bikes today. Obviously, parallel twins, perhaps mostly for emissions and cost reasons, but parallel twins are in everything now. You know, most of them have 270-degree firing order, and this kind of adventure sports market, whatever you want to call it, has kind of become the predominant market now that sport bikes, well, I should say now, it's been over a decade really, but since sport bikes are no longer the kind of money makers that they used to be. So, what do I think of the TDM itself? I think it's really smooth. It's surprisingly smooth. Sorry, I'm getting blown around a little bit here as we're beside the ocean. For a parallel twin, it's ridiculously smooth. It feels almost smoother than my Tracer in some ways, which is surprising considering that's a triple. The gearbox feels fantastic. Brakes feel okay. It's kind of nice, honestly, to ride an old bike that belongs to a mechanic, because this thing is just so well maintained. I mean, I think you probably saw at the start. No choke. It's like 10 degrees today, and this bike started right up with no choke whatsoever, which all the carbureted bikes I've ever owned, I mean, anything less than like 15, you were going full choke and giving it a little bit of throttle to get it to start. So to have a bike that's this well sorted, It just feels super cool for the age of it. But anyway, the riding position, obviously you can see my upper body. It's really open. It feels like an adventure bike today, or a sports adventure bike. Really wide handlebars, little kind of half windscreen there. It does okay. It's keeping the wind off my chest at least, if not off my helmet. But the upper body position is really comfortable. What I find different from kind of more modern adventure sport bikes is the foot position, which I guess you won't really be able to see from this perspective, but my feet are definitely a lot more tucked up. Not uncomfortably so, but for example, again, compared to my Tracer, they feel a little bit higher, and my knees feel a little bit more bent. It feels kind of similar to like an FZ6 or an FZ1 that Yamaha put out in the kind of early 2000s. So I guess you can see a bit of lineage there between this bike and those bikes. But otherwise, it's just a, super comfortable bike, and still fairly capable. I mean, 70 horsepower is not a lot, but again, it's so smooth, and it makes the torque pretty low down. I won't say it sounds fantastic. Obviously, it's got stock pipes and, medium displacement, parallel twins. They're never going to sound the best, but you can't complain about it that much. Clocks-wise, I really like the clocks on this. Again, they're kind of like, what's the word? They're kind of walking the line between sports bike and I guess something a little more touring oriented. Like you can see the gauge cluster, the way it's got the plastic coming out of it, where it kind of looks like a sport bike gauge cluster, where they were just kind of free floating. But obviously this one's kind of enclosed in the plastic that makes up the fairing. But it's still got like the fake carbon fiber around the tachometer and the fuel gauge there. They kind of want it to feel sporty. I'd say for the late 90s, it's got a pretty nice display. I mean, it's got digital clock, which I owned enough bikes without clocks on them, and that's honestly kind of nice still. And a fuel gauge, analog fuel gauge on the right there, which, again, super uncommon for late 90s bikes, at least everything I've ridden. Mostly just fuel lights and stuff like that. So it feels pretty well spec'd for a late 90s bike as well. It feels pretty modern in that sense. What else? As far as riding position, I don't love the seat. A lot of old bikes are like this. The material on the seat, it's like the kind of standard vinyl material, but it's super slippery, so you can't always get super comfortable, because every time you hit the brakes, you kind of slide forward a little bit, which is not super comfortable. Also, not a lot of room to slide back and forth, surprisingly. You're kind of in the one position that Yamaha has deemed appropriate, and if you don't like it, then too bad. Also, I'll say it's definitely not as tall as it looks. I don't know. I don't really think I can get the camera to point down there, but I've got a pretty significant bend in my knee. The seat height is really low. It definitely feels like you're sitting in the bike and not on the bike, which could be good or bad depending on your height and how you feel about that. I'm 6'5". I don't find this uncomfortable. It would be nice if the seat had another inch or two, but certainly really good ground reach. I think anybody, probably regardless of height, could put a foot down on this. Speaking of foot positioning and things like that, the pegs on this are kind of weird. When you put your foot, especially on the right peg, it feels like your heel is touching the exhaust. But there's actually like a little, just like a little stick-out metal plate that comes off the foot peg mount, which I suppose is for your boot to rest on so that it doesn't touch the exhaust. But the first time I got on here, I was like, is my foot touching the exhaust? Am I going to melt my boot here? But no, they actually kind of did think about that. So it's got dual exit mufflers, so one muffler for each cylinder, I guess, which looks pretty cool. Kind of as was the style back in the 90s, the dual exit mufflers. I still really like that look. I know we've kind of gotten away from that for a reason. it adds weight and complexity and all that. But especially from the rear, I always think dual mufflers just look really nice. The symmetry is cool. Otherwise, the paint job is pretty 90s. Again, you can probably see this like burgundy on the tank, paired with like a light blue. The fairing does okay at keeping wind off you. There isn't really anything on your legs. So again, it's pretty chilly today. My legs are definitely feeling the wind. Not the most aerodynamic fairing. Again, it's just super smooth. I'm really surprised. Engine braking feels strong as well. Red line's to 8 grand. It feels high enough. I'm never going to complain about more revs, but the torque starts coming on a little after 3 anyway, so you feel like you've got enough to play with. You don't really feel like you have to short shift it or anything. And again, the torque's also kind of enough that you can really just pop it in like 4th or 5th and cruise if you want to. I don't know. It doesn't feel particularly sporty to me, but maybe I'll try to get a shot of the tires after this. The owner, my friend who owns this TDM, took it to the track, I think twice within the past month, and he made full use of the tires, right all the way to the edge on the rear tire. So he said the limiting factor, honestly, was the exhaust. He was touching down on the right side exhaust. I think he actually put a couple scrapes in it. So he said it's got pretty good turning clearance, but I mean, obviously, not a sport bike, so I'm not surprised that he was making contact there. But still, he said it performed pretty well on the track. It's really skinny, I guess because of the parallel twin engine. It feels kind of small between your legs. You know, easy to get a good grip on the tank. I could see that being nice on the track too. Yeah, just incredibly smooth. For a parallel twin especially. Try to stop in here and we'll kind of give you a look around the bike.
All right, TDM 850, 99, 2000, pretty stock. This is the revision of the second generation, which you can tell because it has the fuel gauge. Revised headlights on the second gen. I kind of prefer the first gen. The first gen had really nice round headlights that look more like a Tenere or a Africa Twin, but this one looks okay. 18-inch front wheel on this guy. You can see the 2 cylinders sticking out of there. Pretty small little half fairing. Again, it doesn't do a great job of keeping wind off your legs. Very 90s coloring. It's kind of look. And then coming around to the rear. So again, this is like a really slippery material, so I don't love the seat. It looks big, but again, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of room to move around. I think it's a 120 section rear tire? It's pretty skinny. I think it's pretty typical for the age, but yeah, you can see those are well-used tires. You can see where he's touched it down right here too, if you're wondering where it touches. It does have luggage hooks, which is nice. So one here and one here. This doesn't like pull out or anything like that, but yeah, you could use it for touring to strap a bag onto the rear. And then under the seat, surprisingly little room. Looks like a tool case, and then this is the ETC rear. for Japanese highways, but yeah, not a lot back there. There's like a little plate, but can't really fit much else in there. It does look like there's adjustment on the rear shock, which is pretty cool. Looks like you don't need tools to do it either, which is always nice to see if you're loading luggage or a passenger or anything like that. But yeah, not a lot under there.
So, I guess the last question is kind of, would I buy one myself? If I were in the market for something a little more classic, would I be considering a TDM? And I think even though I've enjoyed my time with it, it's been a little short, but I've enjoyed my time with it, I think the answer is probably no. I think like a lot of all-rounders, it kind of suffers from not doing anything particularly well. I feel like if I wanted to get something that was a little more reminiscent of like old big trailies or kind of old Dakar style bikes, I'd want to get something that was actually a little more off-road focused, right? I'd rather get like an Africa Twin or an old Transalp or even an old Tenere if we're sticking with Yamaha. And if I wanted something to do like kind of upright sports touring on, maybe even a potential track day, I feel like there's better options for that too. I'd rather get like an old FZ1 with the inline 4 engine from the first gen R1. I just feel like there's kind of better options out there, regardless of kind of what you want to do with it. Even if you love this engine, if you love parallel twins, but you wanted something a little more sporty, right, you'd probably go with the TRX 850, the exact same engine, but different frame and a sportier riding position. So anyway, I think that just about sums up my thoughts on the Yamaha TDM. It's an interesting bike. I'm not sure it's really the one for me. Not something I'd add to my bucket list. Is he warning me about police? I guess we'll find out. But, where were we? Sorry, that guy waving at me kind of distracted me there. It's an interesting bike. It feels very ahead of its time in the way that this style of bike is kind of what dominates the market now. Right? 700 to 900 cc parallel twins, 270-degree crank, fairly upright ergos, kind of styled after off-road bikes, but no real capability, we could say. So it feels very ahead of its time in that way, and I think it's an interesting time capsule now looking back. But anyway, let's get over here. I think that'll be it from me on the TDM. Let me know your thoughts on this one. I'm curious if anyone's owned one of these. Kind of what you thought of it. Did you love it? Did you hate it? These, I think, made it over to North America for a year or two, but I think that was for the first revision in the really early 90s, not this later, mid to late 90s version. So it's not really a bike that I'm super familiar with. It's certainly not one I'd seen on the roads in Canada before I moved to Japan. So I'm curious to hear the thoughts of someone who's owned this or ridden one a little more extensively than I have. Let me know what you loved about it. But anyway, from behind this bus, I think that's it from me. Thanks a lot, guys, and we'll catch you in the next one.